I'm Thomas Ermacora, a futurist and city architect. I've worked in the field for about 25 years, and I'm joined today by two illustrious friends and peers, Jor Ben-Chetrit and Alexander de Hoog, who each are equally extraordinary designers and thinkers of the future of city. And I'm going to start giving you a little brief introduction to what I feel has led us to this point intellectually on the future of regenerative community design. So, really what I think regenerative community design is about is a bit like when you rethink the way that you're going to eat. It's about being conscious about what you're putting in your mouth. And making cities is about being conscious together about how we want to live meaningfully. And ultimately, the objective is community well-being, and the practice of regenerative design should also allow for us to live on this planet with harmony. I'm not in sync or in harmony with this machine yet, but it's coming. So I'm going to give you a brief history of the generations of what we call intentional communities. The first generation, or what I call generation zero, is where we really focused on subsistence or defense. And I'm just going to give you an image. You could choose any image from anywhere in the world, and we started to make cities as basically small villages. And they had the purpose of having all the functions that you would need to feed yourself and protect yourself. So this was not really an intentional community from what we understand it today, but it was a departure, a radical departure from being uncivilized, agrarian societies that basically were living in caves, etc. So that's why there is a design element to this. The second, or the first rather, from what I see, the first generation is what we could consider the colonizing or evangelizing moments. You may have seen the movie The Mission with Jeremy Irons, where he is effectively a missionary. And, you know, it talks a lot about war with Spain. But there are many incredible intentional communities, actually, that were religious communities that were there to try and evangelize and colonize Latin America. And they were situated somewhere between Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, mostly with the Guarani population. And what's really fascinating, even though they ended relatively quickly because they were in opposition to what the Spaniards wanted to do, they were forms of integration between indigenous communities and Western civilization and religious orthodoxy, at the time Catholic. And it produced some really quite extraordinary places. However, they were short-lived. And generation two for me is what then is called the early industrial age utopias. Some of you may have heard of the philosopher Charles Fourier, who talked about phalansteries. It's a difficult word, phalansteries. And so they were basically an all-encompassing pre-industrial or pseudo-industrial unit where everyone would live together and nature was sort of around it. So you could say it was an effort to densify the kind of intentional community model and integrate industrialism. And there were also a set of ethics around it. But basically, this was a way forward, in their view, away from the industrial city that was becoming, you know, essentially a very difficult place to live in because of soot and the pollution in the environment. So these were already departures from industrialism. And similarly, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there was a movement called the Garden City movement, started by a thinker from Britain called Ebenezer Howard. And these were, let's say, peri-urban cities that were self-standing. They were neighborhood size, small city, and they were there to create a sort of relationship to the city that would build a lung in between, a green lung in between. So it was a way of transforming industrialism. Then generation 3, roughly in the 60s, what I would simplify as hippie communities that many of you probably are familiar with here. And so, you know, they take many shapes and forms. They can be, you know, master planned from above in a radical way, or they could be very simplistic, very agrarian in sort of aesthetic. This is in Costa Rica. This is a very ambitious project in India called Auroville, and this is really quite still a unique place to visit. You could say it's a sort of memory, an urbanistic memory of utopian hippie idealism. And it's very unique. In Denmark, you have some kind of pseudo-garden cities that came up, and people were living radially, the way that they would subdivide agriculture. So it's a way to try to connect the city with its backdrop. This is Damanhur in northern Italy, a very famous intentional community. So I wrote my thesis on intentional communities many, many years ago, which is why, you know, I still have some interest in seeing, you know, what did we learn from these? And so they were trying to think about new rituals, new ways to bring communities together that were not associated with the common religious rhetorics. This is Arco Santi in the middle of the desert near Phoenix, and also a very beautiful architectural statement by Paolo Soleri, unfortunately very founder-led, and it stopped. We then moved on into generation 4, which is relatively recent, I would say after 1990, when we were at the so-called end of history, where we would look at large-scale intentional communities, new cities that were fully self-sufficient from an energy and a food supply standpoint. This was Masdar in the desert near Dubai, with a lot of interesting technology, however, relatively limited in terms of what it's done for the world, because too expensive to replicate, difficult to do. This is Bedzed, a very interesting, not high income, but medium income community outside of London that had a number of features like rainwater collection, solar panels, small gardens and allotments, and a way to sort of look at intentional community and suburbia. So still an interesting example. This is an example from Toronto, which didn't see the light of day, a city that was started by Sidewalks Lab, which is an offshoot of Google, which was shut down mostly politically. So, you know, I could keep going on. You know, there are many versions of these techno-utopias, and they haven't really delivered on what we're hoping. So where we are today, really, is this generation 5, where we're seeking to have regenerative urbanism and distributive urbanism. And you're going to hear from Dror here, who I've worked with, who is a designer and the inventor of a new view on how we could make cities. So instead of have grid planning, we could mimic the body and effectively do biomimicry at the urban scale through cellular cities, and do a totally new set of construction automation approaches that radically transform the paradigm of city making. But you're going to hear a lot about that. I'm really excited for you to hear about that. So what are some of the principles of intentional communities that were always there? They were often in a remote location. They had an idea about the commons and a shared infrastructure, and the land use, nature, and farming was relatively integrated, and they often had some form of post-religious spiritual inclination to sort of bind people in a community. So these are all very interesting and attractive, and of course you can see from this that there are thousands of possible iterations, many yet still to discover. Today there's an organization called the Global Eco-Village Network, which lists more than 500 in the world. So this is a continuing movement. However, there are some issues with intentional communities, and particularly the failure points, from my view, is that they've often been founder-led imaginations that have a need for some kind of radical governance structure that's not particularly flexible. Also, the interaction with the outside reality is sort of abstracted and unnetworked, so it's hard to create economies of scale. And finally, what I think is problematic is that in many cases they either have a form of technological skepticism or they have a conceptual obsolescence where they're married to a moment in technological history that defines them too much. Like, for example, the Sidewalks Lab exam or Masdar. Ultimately, many of these have become, in some ways, unrealistic, unreplicable, and therefore limited in scope approaches to making cities. And we are continuing a new, let's say, generation of explorations. This is a project I was involved in the beginning where Bjarke Ingels took over the design lead, called OceanX, trying to create floating cities, because in many parts of the world we will need that. This is a project I also was involved in with Dror out in Saudi Arabia called The Line, which is the largest urban project in history, an infrastructural project. However, it's very fantastical, and do we really want to be living in a line that's 500 meters high that will take as much CO2 as many countries' output for many years and pretend to be sustainable? And how do we solve for the refugee crisis that's looming all over the world? And with climate refugees, we might reach up to 250 or 300 million that need to find some form of permanent housing. Could it look like this? Could we make this all year round? The ever question for Burning Man fans, as I am. And townships all over the world, needs solving. So my history and what I've tried to solve for continually has been to think through my design career and as a futurist how we could make cities in different ways and how we can embed technologies in ways that put the human at the center through participation processes. So I wrote a book about participatory placemaking called The Recoded City, which focused on how you co-create cities. And that eventually led me to make three great conclusions, I would say. The first one is that coming from master planning, which many of you probably know from big projects, I think it's a form of dead discipline. We need to push towards more rapid micro-planning so we don't get bogged down in large technocratic issues and communities can participate more. And they need to be enthusiastic but intelligent about how they use technology so that we have all the possible tools, including artificial intelligence. And finally, last but not least, culture is the real glue. This is how we make it happen. And Tomorrowland, is a demonstration. Love Tomorrow, it starts through culture and being together to really have the necessary collective imagination to live together meaningfully and in harmony with the planet. So to me, a regenerative civilization is the answer to most of the problems we have out there, which is why I focus on it. And I'm looking forward to have you listen now to Dror to give you a shining example of what that could look like. Thank you very much.